Right, so I didn't record enough B-roll for a proper introduction, so TLDR, I'll be making a Deadpool-inspired Space Marine. For this project, I used one of the cheeky chappies from the Primaris Infiltrators box. The more lightweight Phobos armour seemed like a good match for Deadpool, and it already had some existing straps on the legs, which would save me having to struggle with green stuff. This pose in particular called to me, as I could picture Wade making some quip about Games Workshop's use of tactical rocks. Off camera, I clipped away the torso and leg parts, then remembered I was meant to be recording this process. From the Infiltrators kit, I also took a right-handed pistol holster, some grenades, and a couple of shoulder pads. I also clipped off his right arm holding a bolt pistol and some unusable footage. The helmet and backpack options in the Infiltrators kit have lots of antennas everywhere, which wasn't really screaming Deadpool to me. The knife options also refused to come as single bladies, so I had to turn elsewhere for these parts. Assault Intercessors were the answer to my prayers. From this kit, I sourced a head, a backpack, a baby knife, and, most importantly, 2 chainswords. Since finishing this project, I've realised that the regular Intercessors have a knife option that isn't attached to anything, and would be a bit easier to work with. So the only bits you really need from the Assault Intercessors are the chainswords. After all the parts had been cleaned up and the mould lines removed, I could move on to putting everything together. With the torso and legs assembled, I then moved on to the arms. As mentioned, his right arm was sourced from the Infiltrators kit, and the left arm was taken from the Primaris Hellblasters box. I wasn't too sure about the positioning of the shoulder pads, so using some white tack, I stuck them roughly in place so I could figure out where the grenades would go. Carefully using a pair of tweezers, I made sure to drop the tiny grenade piece onto the table, before trying again with my fatter fingers and surprisingly failing there too. Off camera, I finally managed to get the grenades to stick and then attach the shoulder pads properly. For the numerous pouches that Deadpool has on his person, I went old school with ammo packs from the Space Marine Tactical Squad. I attached these to either side of his belt and hoped that they wouldn't interfere with the pistol holsters. Said pistol holsters were sourced from the Infiltrators and Hellblasters kit. Unsurprisingly, the Infiltrators holster could just be slapped straight onto one of the straps. I temporarily attached the knife to his lower leg here using some white tack, so I could make sure that the holster wouldn't get in the way of the knife later on. The Hellblaster holster came with an excess strap that needed to be clipped away and shaved down until it was nice and flat. This was then glued onto the opposite leg in about the same position as its buddy. While the chainswords from the Assault Intercessors kit were free of any meddlesome hands, they did have some offending pouches which would need to be removed. Using some older clippers, I removed a good chunk of the plastic before turning to file and some sandpaper to gradually smooth out the cut section. I also used my hobby knife to score out some lines along the chainsword's engine. I didn't have much of a plan for attaching the chainswords to the backpack, other than to slap some glue onto them and hope for the best. While this worked well enough, I think I could have taken some of the pain out of the painting stage if I'd taken the time to use some pinning here. In an attempt to minimise the bullying from strangers on the internet, I made sure to drill my gun barrels. To start, I used my hand drill to drill through the sides of the gun barrels. Then for the main barrel hole, I made a small indentation near the centre with my hobby knife, which would act as a guide before I drilled away. Now that I couldn't put it off any longer, I mixed together some green stuff for an extra leg strap. Using bucket loads of water to keep the green stuff as soaking wet as Deadpool wielding, I rolled out a thin strip of the putty and then used some dentist tools and a mould line remover to cut out a small section. I wrapped the strip around his lower right leg and used some tools to roughly combine the two ends. Finally, some excess green stuff was shaped into a wee square that would sit on top of the joint and cover my shame. Speaking of shame, I took a page out of X-Men Origins Wolverine to fuse together the mouth area of the helmet. To achieve this, I slathered some milliput all over the vents at the bottom of the helmet before using some silicone tools and water to remove any excess. With my glasses back on, this is what the end result looked like. I glued the tactical rock and foot to the base, then coated the rest of the base in some Warworld Scenic spacing glue. Keeping this spoiler-free, for the base I was going for a recreation of the desert-like environment seen in the trailers, which meant lots of torn-up cork rocks scattered everywhere. I left the green stuff, milliput and basing glue to dry overnight, then returned to the baby knife. The excess pouch was removed using some clippers and my hobby knife before being attached with plastic glue on the plastic contact points and super glue on the green stuff. Using a hand drill, I drilled a 1mm size hole in the parts I wanted to keep separate for painting. For the head, again I used my hobby knife first to help centre the hole. I cut out some strips of 1mm wire and created plastic lollipops with some super glue. These forbidden snacks were then embedded into some cork holders for me to hold on to when painting. Finally, I sanded down the front of the helmet to make the mouth section nice and smooth. Before I could start painting, I primed everything using Vallejo's black primer, making sure it didn't pool in any areas. Once that was dry, I then covered the base in Armageddon Dust to build up some ground texture. I wasn't too careful here, as any bits I got onto the boots would just help with tying the model to the base. Working outwards, I started with the deepest parts of the model, painting black on top of black for the under armour using Abaddon Black. Again, I was pretty messy here, as I knew any overspill would be covered up later. The bulk of the armour was then coated with Khorne Red to get a nice dark red finish. For this step, I made sure to pay particular attention to any focal points on the model. This took a good 4 layers to get solid coverage, so I think I need to work on not thinning my paint so much. In hindsight, it also would have been better to do this colour roughly first, then go in with the black. But you live and you learn. Next, it was time to plate these 50 caliber Desert Eagle pistoleros with some gold. For this, I used Retributor Armour mixed with some Lahmian Medium to help it go on in a couple of thin down coats, which I think worked quite well. Returning to Abaddon Black, I then went over the chainswords to cover up the primer and any red overspill. Then, with a smaller brush, I went over all the various straps and the little circle on his belt buckle, resisting the urge to add Deadpool's logo. Next, I covered these instep guard things as well as the soles of his wee booties, and finally finished with a skull icon on his chest. The backpack got some strategically placed sections of black to help make it a bit more interesting, then I moved on to the head. With the base of the neck coated, I held my breath and carefully painted on the markings around his eyes. I took my time here, sketching in the rough shape before filling it in and gradually building it up. I was pretty chuffed with the end result, which looked a little something like this. After an eternity spent with Abaddon Black, moving on to the various leather sections was a welcome change. For this step, I used Mournfang Brown to coat the pistol holsters, ammo pouches and belt. Next, I turned to Caliban Green to coat the frag grenades, followed by Leadbelcher mixed with Lahmian Medium for the grenade pins, as well as the other grenades on his right side. After much hemming and hawing over what colour to paint the chainsword's grip with, I eventually settled on Corvus Black to make it ever so slightly different to the rest of the chainsword. With that incredibly daring colour applied, I returned to my Leadbelcher mixture and applied this to the metallic parts of the backpack, chainsword and helmet. I then also applied it to these parts of the body where straps run through, to make them look like buckles. With the metallic areas now dry, I applied some Dead World Forest to the body of a smoke grenade. Then, for the final part of the Marine's base coat, I went in with some Ulthuan Grey for the eyes. Relieved that bit of precision was over, I whipped out the monster brush for some heavy-handed application of Tallarn Sand across the entirety of the base. I then thinned it down with a lot of water and splattered it across the base of the feet to try and give them the appearance of being coated in dirt. Once that coat was dry, I went in with some cheap makeup brushes to dry brush increasingly lighter 50 shades of beige onto the ground. Starting with Tallarn Sand mixed with Ushabti Bone, followed by Ushabti Bone on its own, and finishing with Wraithbone. Moving on to shading, I slabbed the leather section of the Darkoath Flesh, then followed up with some Cygor Brown mixed with contrast medium to darken the holes of the pistol holster. Nuln Oil, aka Liquid Talent, was used for recess shading across the armour and to help add some depth to areas painted with Leadbelcher. Lastly, Reikland Fleshshade was applied to the gold-plated 50 caliber Desert Eagle pistoleros, as well as to the metal grenades to help dull the latter down a bit. At this point, I was just wanting to wrap the project up, so I applied some quick edge highlights to some select parts of the model. The original base colour of the leather sections, Mournfang Brown, was brought out again for some edge highlighting and to create some tiny scratches using a fine tip brush. Wazdakka Red was then used to highlight the red armour. In hindsight, I could have been a bit bolder with this colour, but I tend to play it a bit on the safe side with edge highlight colours so as not to draw too much attention to the quality of them. Mechanicus Standard Grey was then used on the black sections, taking the easy wins where possible with any long, hard edges. I wasn't very happy with how dark the gold-plated 50 caliber Desert Eagle pistoleros were after the Reikland Fleshshade bath, so I went back over the raised areas with some Retributor Armour to bring the original colour back. Then, to help lighten the gold further, I dry brushed some Liberator Gold onto the guns, followed by another dry brush of Stormhost Silver on the top areas. Finally, Stormhost Silver was then also used as a highlight for the other metallic areas. With the various sections of the model fully painted, I now had to remove them from their temporary holders and put them all back together again. Before I could reattach anything, I scraped off the paint from each of the contact points so that the glue would act on the plastic underneath instead. This part was actually quite satisfying. It felt a bit like revealing the results of a scratch card, but with a bit less crushing disappointment. Having ruined my plastic glue applicator at this stage in another project, I opted instead to use super glue to join everything back together. I tidied up the rim with some Abaddon Black, then applied a coat of 50/50 AK Ultra Matte varnish and contrast medium, making sure to avoid any metallic areas. And with that, the God Emperor's Perfect Idiot was finally finished. If you made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. I had a great time working on this wee fella, and while the whole video creation process took far longer than I expected, it's given me a whole new appreciation for what all goes into making this type of content. Anyway, I'm excited to be done and looking forward to returning to some actual hobbying again. After all, he does look awfully lonely all on his lonesome up there.